guys, so it is day 28 of our national lockdown here in Israel. I'm currently walking at least 1K away from our campus, so we have some loops that we can do that we know are within the 1K that we're allowed to go. But thankfully, we found out yesterday that the lockdown, it isn't officially ending on Sunday, but the 1K restriction will be done. So I think shops and restaurants are still staying closed, but travel will be opened up. So I'm really excited that maybe I'll get to see a few things before I leave here. Who would have thought that would be such a luxury, but this is the COVID world that we live in. So I am just passing the Dormition Abbey Church. You can see it right up there. Pretty beautiful. And I thought I'd find a nice place to sit so that we could talk about names. I've been pondering names and their significance and their power, especially within the biblical worlds. So let's find a place to sit. I didn't get to bring my tea because I figured I would probably spill burning hot water all over myself somehow, and that would be not preferable. So today it's just theology, but in the ancient city of Jerusalem. So, I mean, it evens out. Okay, here is a nice spot. We are right outside of the Church of the Dormition Abbey, and I think I can take my mask off as long as no one is around. And so as I was saying, I was thinking about names this week, particularly in the biblical context, but we've also been learning about the importance of names in ancient Egypt. So in the Bible, to receive a name was to exist. And so one's name, it wasn't just about a series of sounds that distinguishes one person from another, but it reveals the fullness of who you are, the type of life that you have lived or the type of life that you're going to hopefully live. So you can take Jacob, for example. His name literally means heel grasper, and we know the story that when he came out grasping his twin brother's heel. But more roughly, his name can translate to the crafty one, the overreacher. And we see this in his adult life. We see that he tricks his brother Esau out of his birthright. We see that he tricks Laban later. He's a very crafty person. And then interestingly, Jacob goes through a very significant name change. This is very common in the Bible, where God takes someone and changes his name or adds something to his name. And so Jacob goes from the crafty one or the overreacher to one who is striven with God, Israel. And he has this incredible experience wrestling with God or wrestling with an angel of God, I guess, depending on which translation you read. And so this name change is really significant because while a name defines your existence and who you are, we also see that you're not stuck in that Jacob could go from being a crafty one to one who was living into a very new type of relationship with God, a new way of life, a more righteous way of life. And so we see a lot of theological significance here, that you don't have to stay the same. You don't have to remain who you were. And God marks that by changing your name, by welcoming you into this new existence. I had to move because it's Shabbat and everyone is trying to get into their homes. You hear that maybe in the background. You can hear that horn sound. That's the call to Shabbat. All right, I think the Shabbat siren is done and the bells are done. The birds are not done, but we will keep going. It's definitely been asked, and rightly so, whether names in the Bible are prescriptive or descriptive. Like, are they just being used as literary devices by the authors to show, wow, this person lived into this kind of life, these characteristics, or was it more prophetic that they were named a certain way and they lived into that? I think you could argue both, and so I want to talk about that next, but I'm actually back at JUC, as you can see. I had a guy tell me that it's not a great time to be out right now in the area I was. It wasn't super safe, and I could tell there were a lot of interesting people approaching me. So I am going to head to Shabbat dinner, have Shabbat dinner, and then we'll continue talking about names after. This time with my tea. Sometimes filming out in the city can work out just great, and other times it can be a little more difficult, as we experienced today. But we'll just consider this phase one of re-entering city life without lockdown, which will be coming soon. So I'm excited for that. And we were talking about names and how sometimes names can be clearly used as a literary device to kind of reflect or to describe someone for the characteristics that the author wants to point out. For example, in 1 Samuel 25, I believe, Abigail's first husband, Nabal, before she becomes David's wife, he is described as a very foolish person in this story, and his name, Nabal, literally means fool. And so it's perfect for the story, and you're like, that's great. But you have to wonder, would parents willingly name their child fool? It's questionable. If so, that would definitely be something they probably would need family counseling about years down the road. But you see, like, that's an example where you think, okay, maybe the author intentionally changed the name here or put a different name because he wants to highlight this characteristic. And then other times perhaps it is more prophetic or prescriptive, and someone like Jacob is named, the crafty one or a heel grasper, quite literally, and he lives into those characteristics. So lots of ways to look at it. Another thing we see with biblical names are the connection between a name and the people group you belong to, the family, the parents, or the God that you worship, the God that you belong to. And in some places in the Bible, we actually see part of God's name being put into someone's name. For example, Jehoshaphat means the Lord will judge, or Zechariah means the Lord will remember, or Hezekiah means the Lord is my strength. So I think we're at least starting to get a picture of how knowing someone's name goes beyond just knowing the sounds that they are called by, but this is to know who they are as a person. It might be revealing characteristics, their family, their relationship with God, who they are called to be. I mean, there's so much packed in to someone's name. And I think we also see this in knowing God's name. The name of God, Yod He Vav He. We don't know exactly how to pronounce it. That's one of the greatest mysteries, right, of the ancient world. But we have the four consonants, the letters. And the vowel pointings that we have now were actually added much later by the Masoretic scribes, Jewish scribes. And they took the vowel pointings from the Hebrew word for Adonai, which means Lord, and they put those vowel pointings onto Yod He Vav He, because in the Jewish tradition, God's name is so holy, and Jewish people don't ever want to disrespect the name. And so normally when you're reading the Torah or you're talking about God, instead of attempting any pronunciation of those consonants, you say Adonai instead, or you say like Hashem, the name. Instead of saying it. Actually, in my Hebrew class just 2 days ago, my professor was teaching us something about Hebrew, and he wrote down part of the divine name and not the whole thing. He stopped, and he won't say it out loud, and he also won't finish writing it, because once you write the name of God, Yod He Vav He, you cannot erase it, because God cannot be erased, and God is permanent, right? So I thought that was very interesting, and I was really quite drawn to the reverence that he holds for God's name. But I think it's interesting that within the context we've been talking about, how to have a name is to exist, and to know someone's name is to know them very holistically. Then we have God's name. It's like he is known to us, and yet there is still a mystery. There's still this mysterious aspect to God, because we don't know how to pronounce his name. We just have these letters, which are actually the breath letters of Hebrew, Yod He Vav He. It's some scholars have connected this word back to Haya, which is the word for to be, to exist. Again, interesting that God's very name could just mean to exist, and we're talking about how names give you existence. So there's just so much great theology in God's name. I love it. But anyways, I digress. Names are just something that are so clearly important in the Bible. And honestly, most of the time when I'm reading through the Bible, especially those genealogies, my eyes are just going as fast as I can through all those names. And I don't often stop to think, wow, what is the story behind this name? And to know that so often God's very own name, or at least part of his name, is put into so many of these names, I think is such a beautiful representation of what he spiritually offers us in being with us, being a part of our identity and our existence is really beautiful. And on a more, I guess, on the negative side of things, you see in the Bible that when there's exile, or like in the case of Joseph, not exile, but when he's sold into slavery into Egypt, his name is changed. You lose your culture, you lose your religious identity and that background. And normally these foreign kingdoms like Babylon or Assyria or Egypt, they change your name. And speaking of names in ancient Egypt, I thought it was really interesting in my class the other day. Dr. Wright was talking about how you'll notice that for the most part, there are a few exceptions, but for the most part in the Bible, when a pharaoh is named, they're not given a name, like a specific name, they're just called Pharaoh. Like in the story of Moses or Joseph, even Abraham, who sees a pharaoh, we're not given the exact name, which has led some scholars to argue that, this is maybe more of a myth or not really historically accurate story, or it was written way later, and so people, didn't know the name of the pharaoh at the time, and maybe there is some truth to explore down those roads. But Dr. Wright was saying, what if in a similar way to what I was talking about in my video about hieroglyphics, this was another way that the people of Israel were moving on from Egypt. They weren't even mentioning the name of Pharaoh, because again, to have a name is to exist, to have this unique identity, and to not have a name or to have your name removed, even worse, that is to no longer exist. That is to be like gone from memory. You have no relevance anymore. And so we see that maybe what the biblical author was actually saying was, we don't even put the Pharaoh's name down because they have no grasp on our history, on our story anymore. And it's also interesting that within ancient Egypt, names also bore such similar significance to what we're learning about with the biblical names. For example, it wasn't uncommon for a pharaoh to have the name of a former pharaoh or some person he didn't like scratched out. Like, let's say they have a tomb built or some monument or something, and if their name is on that tomb in hieroglyphics, which is supposed to be eternal, we learned that in one of my videos last week, when you have their name scratched out, that is to remove them from existence. And even if they're in the afterlife enjoying their stuff over there, you destroy them. Like, you still have this connection to them even after they die, which I thought was very interesting. And it also reminded me of a verse in Revelation, Revelation 3:5, where it talks about some people having their name blotted out of the book of life, being taken out of existence. And I think that of course opens a theological discussion on what we think about eternity and hell and existence after death, and that can be an entirely different Mintian theology. But anyways, all of this to say, what's in a name? Apparently a whole lot of stuff. And we are just barely scratching the surface. So thanks for watching this week's episode of Mintian Theology. And before I end the video here, I was thinking, if you feel willing to share, you want to share, I would love to learn what your name is and what the meaning of your name is in the comments below. And perhaps another interesting question would actually be, looking back on your life, however long you've lived, is that the name you would choose now? If you could choose your own name for yourself based on the characteristics you see in yourself and the life you've lived, what would be the name that you would choose? Maybe it would be the exact same name you were given at birth. Maybe it would be different. So feel free to comment that below. My name, Carys, is the Welsh spelling of a Greek word, charis, meaning grace. And that is something that I am, constantly striving for. I want to live a life that is grace-filled, that offers grace to others and to myself, honestly. I have to learn that as well. And so I'm gonna take this week to really reflect on my own name and how I have lived into it, maybe how I have not lived into it, and see what ways I can grow from that. So thanks again for watching this week's episode, and I will see you next time.